Good morning, everyone. Welcome to GOMSWG 2020, a summer GOMSWG like none other. We're going to wait a few more minutes before we start the meeting just to give everyone a chance to join. I'll mute myself. If you want to say good morning in the chat, that'd be great. We're asking everyone to stay muted to avoid background noise during the presentations. So we can stay muted and rely on the chat for comments, questions, and just saying hello to one another. So we'll start in a few moments.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. It looks like we have 39 participants and no one's out in the waiting room waiting to get in. So I think we can get started. Thanks, everyone, for joining us this morning. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Don Lyons with National Audubon. I appreciate everyone bearing with us today as we try doing this with a new format. Fingers crossed, we won't run into any significant technical challenges. We seem to be doing okay so far. Our general approach is going to be to go through slides for each island and have presenters speak when their island comes up. I'd ask everyone to sign up on our sign-in sheet. There is a link to that sign-in sheet in the chat, and I think that'll keep coming into the chat. We'll try and keep that in the chat so everybody can find it. But that's just a Google Doc that you can click on the link and then just sign your name and your email address. If anyone has any problem accessing that, you could email one of us with Audubon. Maybe Sue Schubel would be the easiest person to email and let us know that you did attend the meeting, and we'll add you to the list ourselves. Sue, why don't you advance to the next slide? Yeah, so for anyone who doesn't use Zoom a lot, I don't know if there's anyone left in the world yet, but just a few pointers on how to use Zoom today. The most important one for the smooth flow of the meeting is this unmute button in the lower left. That's just a toggle switch. If you click on that, you unmute yourself, and you can click on it again to mute yourself. We ask that all of the audience stay muted, and then that will help us avoid the background noise during presentations. For speakers, when it is your turn to speak, you'll see a map of your island come up, or islands, and you can click there to unmute yourself, give your presentation. We'll see if there are questions, and then you can mute yourself when your portion of the program is complete, and we'll move on to the next person. If you want to see the list of participants, that is, you can bring that up by clicking that participants button. If you want to see the chat, and I hope you all will, there's a chat button that'll bring up a box. You can chat to the group. You can chat privately to any participants. And we're hoping to have questions land in the chat rather than 40 of us try to speak all at once. So our agenda today is pretty straightforward. We're just going through our startup period right now, and then we'll work through island presentations starting from north to south, and we'll work through that. We'll have questions in the chat, and then at the conclusion of each presentation, we'll go through the chat questions if there are any, and then move on to the next island. We'll have time at the end. We set aside 3 hours. It won't take us 3 hours to work through these presentations. So we'll have time at the end for general questions and discussion. We can start that by using the chat box, but I think we can open that up to a more verbal discussion at that point, and we can see how that goes. Depending on how many people want to participate, we should be able to do that verbally, and it still work relatively smoothly. Okay, let me check the waiting room just to make sure nobody's out there. I don't see anyone, so that's good. So I think we're ready to move forward, Sue. Could you move a slide forward? And, you know, I should acknowledge Sue Schubel is operating the slides today and has done an amazing amount of prep to help us hopefully move smoothly through the technology challenges. Oh, and here's again kind of instructions for speakers, and that's again, stay muted until your island comes up. We'll be thrilled to hear your presentation. We'll work through questions on the chat with either Sue or I reading those questions. And then when we're done with any given island, you can mute yourself. And again, for the audience, please stay muted during the presentation, during all of the presentations. Enter questions into the chat, and then wait for that period after the presentations are done when we can kind of open it up. All right, Sue, why don't we move forward? Yeah, you know, this slide just shows the general geographic range. We're talking the Gulf of Maine. I think everyone's familiar with the general area that our working group is focused on. We kind of are bracketed today, I believe, by Machias Seal and Monomoy. I think our presentations will span that range. I'm not aware of anyone who can participate from Nova Scotia this morning or Buzzards Bay. I guess if you're from Nova Scotia and you're on the line and you have some information to present, why don't you unmute yourself? But I don't believe anyone is. I don't think Julie McKnight is on here this morning. All right, why don't we move forward, Sue? We're ready for the Machia Seal group to present.
Okay, hi, can you hear me? Can everybody hear me?
Sarah, I can hear you. You're a little muffled, but I think you'll be okay if you project.
Oh, okay, all right. So yeah, we're out on the island right now, and the internet is not great, so I do apologize. Yeah, do I have I guess a slide with all the stats and stuff? Oh gosh. Okay, cool. There we are. Beautiful. Okay, so I guess I don't know everyone else's situation as far as COVID goes, but we did not get out onto the island until July 4th. Oh, it says it right there on July 4th.
Sarah, I'll just jump in. You're quite muffled on audio for me. I'm not sure if there's anything you can do about it on that end, but and I see Heather volunteered to jump in.
I don't know. Yeah, that might need to happen. I can type things in the chat, or I'll just do that now.
Actually, you're sounding great right now, Sarah. I think whatever you did has helped.
Is this better? I'm like talking into the bottom of my computer, so hopefully this works. Okay, so I'm good now?
I believe so. Yeah, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, I'm going to try again. Okay, so yeah, our normal season starts mid-May, and we unfortunately were not able to get out here until July 4th. This was supposed to be a term census here. According to the keepers out here, I think about a week or two before we arrived, they said that there were more terns landing than they had ever seen before, and nesting and getting ready to breed. And then we got out here a couple weeks after that, and there was no sign of terns at all. And we think the main reason for that is that because we were so delayed coming out here, we actually had gulls nesting on island. There are 4 chicks that we know of that actually were hatched, and they're probably going to fledge. But there's been a lot of gull activity on the island. So unfortunately, we think that may have just wiped out what was here of the terns. We've seen earlier when we were here on July 4th, there were around 40 or so that were flying around, but they have never landed since then. So unfortunately, yeah, no terns this year. Let's see what else. So yeah, no census for Razos or Mers this year. We did that last year. Commune census resulted in about 620 breeding pairs. Again, from what the keepers told us about what happened prior to our arrival, the razorbills actually were rafting up quite early this year. I think in March is what they said. And it appears as though the puffins were also quite early. The past few days, I think this whole week really, there's been hardly any signs of puffins on the island. Most of them have fledged, most of our prod burrows have fledged, so despite what we thought about them being late this year because of the worm blob and the Gulf of Maine, they actually ended up being early, which was fortunate for them because it does appear that the food might be running out. We did, however, have a lot of large herring coming in. Even the puffins were bringing in very large herring, which was encouraging. But it does seem like within the past week or so, it started to die off, and it's a lot of butterfish, a lot of really small hake, some haddock. They were also bringing in like shrimp and stuff. So very interesting variety. But yeah, that's really all we know about what happened on the island since we got here. Unfortunately, we don't have really robust productivity estimates because we were not able to monitor throughout the full season. I think that's about all I have, unless anybody has any questions, I guess.
I would direct people, if anyone had difficulty hearing Sarah. Heather's putting some additional comments in the chat, transcribing a little bit of what Sarah covered. I see that we have a question from Steve Press. Did you guys have any gannets around this year?
So when we got here, there was one gannet hanging around, no nests. And then maybe about a week ago, we had about 5, like 3 juveniles and 2 adults, and that was very short-lived. And then we haven't seen the gannet probably in the past 4 or 5 days. So it appears that he is gone as well.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. I guess, do you have any, I'll just ask a question myself. I'm just curious on the body condition of any puffins that you handled near fledging, and if you have any assessment of how well fed those birds were.
Yeah, so we've been doing lawn fledge checks, which for those of you, I guess, who may not know, out here, we're lucky enough to have like a mowed lawn area where a lot of the puffin fledgers will show up as they kind of try to make their way towards the sea, but get distracted by the lighthouse. So we have a unique opportunity to really assess fledging condition because we know that's when they're fledging. And we started those not early July, sorry, it was like July 20th. And the early fledgers that we had were in pretty good body condition, you know, pretty good weight, over 300 grams, wing chords around 130 or so. But now it seems like we're kind of on the other end of peak fledge, and we're actually finding quite small chicks, which I kind of is to be expected for anyone that's laying pretty late. Wing chords are still about the same, 130 to 140, but the mass is a bit smaller. And there actually have been some that have been too small to actually hold bands. So yeah, we've seen a kind of a decrease in the body size and quality of them as we've kind of gotten over peak fledge, it seems like.
I see another question from Steve. What were the main foods delivered for puffins through most of the summer?
Yeah. So when we started doing feeding stents in early July when we got here, it was a lot of hake, although some very large hake. And then about mid-July, it switched over to haddock, and decent size haddock, which is what happened last year. It went from hake to haddock, and I think that was the same with the other Gulf of Maine islands. But then, yeah, for whatever reason, and I think Andrew Pershing had said something about some cold waters around Grand Manan, and perhaps that's why. But we had large herring coming in, like large herring, 2.5, 3 bill lengths, like just big herring coming in. But then, of course, that was interspersed with like the weird stuff, the butterfish, the shrimp, the squid, and stuff like that. But it was consistently large herring for quite a while, which was encouraging.
And
yeah, and I guess for Lauren, she said, were there any unusual prey? Yep. I guess unusual is kind of based on my experience, but yeah, we did see them coming in with shrimp, not euphausids, but shrimp, which I hadn't seen. Not a lot of them, but that was probably the most unusual thing coming in. Otherwise, it was the normal kind of stuff. But there's been a lot of butterfish, way more butterfish than there were last year.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. So maybe we'll move on to our next island.
Okay.
Sue, if you could advance us there. Thanks very much, Sarah. And now we're ready for Ship Island.
Dawn, you skipped Petite Manan.
We did. Let's see. We'll do Petite Manan. I guess we had them out of order. Sorry about that. Linda, are you going to jump in for both of these?
Our island technicians, Joe and Amanda, are going to do the Petite Manan report.
Excellent.
Hopefully.
Yeah, we're here. Sorry about that. I didn't know when to chime in. Okay, so we conducted our GOMSWG census on June 15th and 16th. We did not conduct a ALCID census, but we did find 959 Cody nests, 342 Artie nests. We didn't find any roseate nests, although we did witness adults loafing on the island a few times. And later on in the field season, we did see some fledglings, but we're not sure if they came from our island or somewhere else. They were unbanded. This is pretty much identical to the census count that was received last year, minus one pair from our estimate. We found 36 common eider nests and a raw count of 548 laughing gull nests, and with a correction that would be 589. So although we didn't do an ALCID census, we did locate as many burrows as we could, and we found 37 puffin burrows that we could actually grub. There were many more that were in the sod that we couldn't necessarily reach, so we didn't count them. Overall, their Atlantic puffin productivity was 0.81, which is pretty good. We only witnessed, I believe, 4 deaths from chicks and only 2 instances of eggs not actually hatching. Razorbills, we observed at least 5 pairs loafing on the island and witnessed those 5 looking for burrows. We only found 3 nests, and out of those 3, only 2 fledged a chick. One of the burrows was, we believe that the egg might have been evicted by a puffin. But as for guillemots, we did band our 1 razorbill fledgling that we could actually get to before it fledged. As for guillemots, we found 46 burrows, and their productivity was at least 1.3 per nest, and their average clutch size was 1.63. We did find a lot of single egg clutches, so our clutch size is, I believe, lower than last year's estimate, which is, I think, 1.84. And Amanda, if you want to start off the provisioning with Arties.
Yeah, so for provisioning for Arties, we had a lot of hake coming in, especially early season, with some pollock and quite a bit of butterfish coming in around July. I didn't see any herring coming in at all. I had about 28% unknown, and quite few prey deliveries. It was only 0.3 per hour. I think that could be time of day. It was difficult early season to get out into the field due to weather inclements and long bouts of heavy fog, so it was difficult to actually get early hours in. But I think overall, I think I had a productivity of 1 on provisioning nests with 7 nests, so they were being well fed. It was just they weren't being fed often, so it was difficult to, really get a good grasp of what they were getting. And if you want to go for your common turn.
Yeah, sure. So common turns, I also got a productivity of 1 for my provisioning nests, and I also had a very low feeding rate of 0.66 prey items per nest, which is an all-time low, I believe. And the food was also, sorry, hake was the primary diet. It was 65.4% of the fish that we identified. Cody's at the end of July started feeding their fledglings butterfish and stickleback, but we did find that they were able to ingest them. I think we only observed 1 instance where a butterfish or a stickleback was fully rejected and not attempted to be eaten again. I did go out sometimes when there were sticklebacks getting rejected and threw them back into the I was watching a productivity plot, and I threw it back in, and the chicks would ingest it just fine if they tried to get it in a second time. But We did have vertebrates. I witnessed euphausids and some insects that were unidentified being fed to coatis. And pollock was about 5.5% of the coati diet, but overall we saw mainly hake, and I saw about 20% herring. Although with alcids, while we didn't do alcid provisioning, we did see primarily hake and herring. And Amanda, if you want to do predator control.
Yeah, so our main issue this season was with the peregrine falcon. Our biologists discovered that there was a pair of peregrine falcons on Jordan's Delight, which is 2 miles off of Petite Manon. We had 78 visits this summer that we've observed, and we had a rate of about 1 time per day, usually in the morning and at night. And he successfully got 21 turns, 14 of those being adults and 7 being fledglings. But upon checking its perches on Green Island, we discovered 6 unknowns that were from unobserved attacks. So he was definitely our biggest problem this summer, and our uses of pyrotechnics seemed to be the most successful. But we discovered that later in the season, nearing the end of July, they became less and less useful, and it was taking up to 4 pyrotechnics individually to dismay one attack. The use of the agro-laser early season was partially successful, but only successful on foggy days and early morning. Sunny days really had no effect on the peregrine falcon, especially when he was perching on the lighthouse, where we would have to physically go up the lighthouse to get the peregrine falcon off, or we'd have to actually use a stick and a flagpole and just create a lot of noise. Other than the peregrine falcon, there was some early predation of eggs from laughing gulls. We did, during our census, oil 279 gull eggs or nests, and we destroyed 269. We still had some success of renesting, as well as some oil eggs or unseen eggs that did hatch. And we did see quite a few fledglings when we left the island yesterday. And we did see some predation early season. As far as lethal control goes, we did lethally remove 2 adult laughing gulls that were too close to Arctic tern nests, 1 adult herring gull that was seen predating chicks, and 1 adult great blackback, which was seen predating eggs early season. So, yeah.
Well, thanks, Joe and Amanda. Nice teamwork on the presentation. I don't see any questions in the chat, so I'm going to jump in with one. I'm curious about the comment about the peregrine coming at night. I'm assuming that means coming around dusk.
Yeah, it means, coming around dusk, around 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock.
Yeah. Did you see any overnight abandonment by terns because of that late in the day visit by the peregrine?
Yes. We had quite a few instances in mid-July where we would have full colony abandonment from basically dusk till dawn, or most of the times it would be about an hour. They would fly low and just shoot out, and they would disappear, but they would always return. But it was always a late night, the dusk dreads that were full.
Great. And then I'm curious how you use the pyrotechnics. Is that only when the falcon is roosting, or are you guys trying something while it's in the air?
We found that it was the most effective when it was flying toward the island. So usually the falcon roosted on a log on Green Island, and it was very easy to notice it because it juts out of the environment. And so we would go over to the boathouse on the north side of the island and wait for it to come over. And typically when it was on the breakwater flying over far away from the tern colony, we would set off a banger to kind of deter it from going in that direction. And typically it would turn around and fly back to the mainland. But in some instances, it would shoot in a different direction from where the banger was shot and go essentially to the south end of the island and just go around us. But roosting, we usually tried to use the laser when it was roosting. It seemed to be the most effective at dawn and dusk and on foggier days. But the first falcon visit we had, I tried to use the laser when it was on the lighthouse, and I shined the laser on it for a solid 3 minutes and it did nothing. So it's kind of better on the ground, I would think.
Thanks for that. That's pretty interesting about techniques to help with peregrines. I see Lauren has a question. Were you guys able to do any trapping or reciting this year? I presume that's relative to Arctic terns, but maybe in other species as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Amanda, go ahead.
So yeah, we did do resighting, but we didn't do any trapping of any adult birds on the island. We just didn't have time and we had a small crew. We did successfully, I think, recite 70 roughly Arctic terns while on the island, as well as quite a few puffins. I don't know the exact numbers, so I think Joe might.
Yeah, so for puffins, we recited 51 unique bands at least, and we recaptured 11 adults and replaced the band on one. We banded 4 new adult puffins and 26 chicks, and we banded a total of 63 black guillemots, 3 adults, 60 chicks, and 1 recaptured adult.
Hey, Dawn, this is Linda, and we didn't do any adult tern trapping due to COVID. Initially, at the beginning of the season, we were limited to the interaction with the crew that we could have, how often we could go out, and the Fish and Wildlife Service felt we couldn't efficiently and safely train the crew to do that following COVID guidelines. So given the smaller crew and those restrictions, we had to limit some of our field activities, and that was one of the things that we dropped this year for safety's sake.
All right, thanks for jumping in, Linda. I see Becky has a question about the laser. Just which laser, what type of laser have you been using with the peregrine?
Sure, it's called an agri-laser, and it's the one that goes to 1,000 meters. I think they have another one that goes to 2,500 meters or something. We initially were told about it from either UNB or Canadian Wildlife Service, that it seemed to be working well for them and their colonies. And so we purchased the lasers, I guess 2 years ago, for the service-owned islands.
Okay, I don't see any other questions, so I guess we'll go ahead and move on. Thanks very much, Joe and Amanda.
Okay, hi everyone. This is Sarah Williams. I was going to talk about Ship Island. I think Percy, one of our crew members, might be on the line, so Percy, feel free to jump in. This was another unusual year on Ship. Just as a background, in 2018, the colony abandoned. It's a small common tern colony, anywhere from 400 to 600 pairs. And even though we never saw or trapped an owl, we think that's what caused the abandonment in 2018. 2019, the birds showed up, the regular timing. They all abandoned again for a brief period and then re-nested after our GOMSWG census, successfully raised chicks, and we're still tending chicks in September, which is pretty unusual. So it was successful last year, but the timing was really off. And again, we have no clear explanation for that delay that happened in 2019. There were definitely some kind of, there were some predators, I think, on the island at some point, but we don't know for sure what it was. So 2020, it's a very similar year to 2019. Our birds showed up in good numbers in May. They started nesting. They abandoned briefly at the beginning of June. And when we did our GOMSWG census on June 17th, we counted 361 nests, but estimate that only about 54 of them were active. Just before the census, we did have birds relaying and re-nesting, and so we did another count on July 6th and counted 301 active nests. So we think our population at SHIP is about 355 common tern pairs. We had productivity plots up, but they were put up late in July or mid-July, and we actually had to take them down with the threat of the hurricane coming because they're so close to the beach. We get storm surges there and didn't want to risk the health of the chicks. So we still have somebody on the island now. Food is great this year out there. It did seem like chicks were a little bit light for a while, but no large scale mortalities of any kind that are obvious to starvation. So that's good. Our trapping efforts have been going on since May. We have mink traps and owl traps, northern goshawk traps. We tried live bait using chuckers, which are a non-native bird that people use for hunting and training dogs in the goshawk traps, and that seemed to work pretty well. What else have we done? We did a full round of vegetation data collection for a sheep grazing study, which this is our pre-grazing data component, and hopefully in the next year or so, we're still working out some of the logistics on that. Hopefully we'll be able to introduce sheep to do intensively grazed plots, like rotational grazing. And yeah, so another strange year. We, again, never heard an owl, saw an owl, found pellets or feathers, but the birds are definitely responding to something out there. Other predators that are normal, peregrine falcons, bald eagles are in the area constantly harassing the neighboring gull and cormorant colonies, but haven't affected the tern colony at all. So that's all I have for SHIP. Percy, do you have anything you wanted to add? I guess not. Okay, thanks everybody.
Thanks, Sarah. I don't see any questions, so I guess we'll move on. And I think next we'll be touching on some of the non-managed or at least non-staffed islands. And I don't know if Sue is going to cover these or if we have someone lined up to speak to these.
I think Brad is going to cover some, and then I have a few notes from John.
I can speak, this is Brad. I can speak to some of the East Penobscot small tern colony slide there as well. You want me to go now, Rick, Don?
Yeah, Brad,
Yeah,
please.
These are mine. Yeah, Kelsey Sullivan and I census half a dozen non-managed islands north of North Haven, East Penobscot Bay, that typically host about 100 common tern pairs, and they bounce around these islands. Most of them are in conservation ownership. Most back in the 80s, when I first went on these islands, they were covered with gulls. Now these islands are basically gull-free, and the terns pretty much have them to themselves. This little Sloop Island's right off North Haven, that had 9 pairs this year, and usually has about that. There's another island to the west of here called Grass Ledge West that had 102. And that seems to be our premier nesting island around here. some of the other islands, Hardhead, Eaton Island Ledge, Green Ledge, Hardhead again, we buzz by those to see if there might be a pocket of terns on them, but there aren't. Generally, they're usually focused on one island, like Grass Ledge West. And I'll just mention that Hardhead, the island pictured here on the bottom, I've been working with Maine Coast Heritage Trust for decades on protecting this, and they managed to finally buy it in the recent past, and management has been transferred to Maine Coastal Islands, and it's a real gem of a seabird island in this part of the Maine coast, and it's pretty exciting that my colleagues at Maine Coastal Islands are now managing that site. Doesn't have the birds that it used to, but it certainly has the habitat if the bird numbers rebound in this part of the coast. So, you know, there's these 100 plus, 120 plus pairs of common terns bounce around this part of the world. They are modestly productive. I do see fledgers, but not huge numbers. I always thought that this group of birds might go to Ship Island that Sarah just talked about, but they seem faithful to Penobscot Bay, and they're hanging in here. So I don't need to belabor the point any more, but we kind of like this little group of islands, and we love that they have common terns every year. That's it for me, Sue. Don.
Yep, and this is Sarah again. We did a census of Connery nub and found 58 common tern nests. This was on June 17th, and 5 nests on 3 bush. And that's all we have.
Yep.
Okay, and I have some late minute information from John, so I can add in Sarah's and John's on new slides if we want to share this presentation somewhere. He saw a total of 30 great cormorant nests, 25 at Seal, 5 at Brimstone Ledge. He saw 60 pairs of common terns at Great Spoon, a minimum of 8 fledgling arties at Wooden Ball, about 25 nests, fledgling eagle at Otter Island, and someone he knows saw a great white shark off Heron Neck Ledge.
Anything else, Sue?
No, that's all from me. But I see
Okay,
Becky.
yeah, well, I'll just read it. So Becky had a question. I believe this is for Brad, based on a comment he made. Just why did the gulls disappear?
Well, just the general lack of gulls on a lot of the islands that tend to be closer to the coast. We've seen this decline for 30 years, of course, but I don't know, if I had to put my finger on one thing, I'd say it all started with bald eagle predation, because this is a pretty high nesting population of eagles on the coast. And it's just, you know, these islands used to be white with gulls, and now to see a pair of gulls up there is almost noteworthy. It ain't what it used to be, Don.
Yeah, those eagles. Huh?
Well, I that's an obvious one. This very island, Hardhead, I've seen eagles fly away with baby herring gulls in each set of talons. It's not uncommon to have these islands just visited by eagles many, many times a day.
Yeah. Okay, great. Becky followed up with just a comment about gull numbers dropping on Appledore Island at Shoals as well. But the speculation there apparently is that there's a landfill closure that may be limiting the supplementary food or anthropogenic foods that has historically been available to gulls. Interesting question.
Very good point. In Maine, the landfills were also closed in the early part of right after 2006, I think it was. So there certainly is potentially a carrying capacity for gulls question on the Maine coast now.
Okay, well, I think that's it for those questions. So I guess we're ready to move on to Seal Island, where I think we're going to get our report from folks on the island.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. This is Keenan, Michaela, and Coco out on Seal. We got out here this year on May 17th, so it was nice to get out here a bit early still. When we arrived, the terns were still settling in, but the puffins were obviously very well settled in, with the majority of our productivity burrows having eggs at that time. And from my experience here, it seemed like on average, puffins laid a bit earlier. And now we have very, very few puffins left around the island, which sounds like was the case on Machias seal as well. Unfortunately, due to the staffing numbers we have here, just limited based on the COVID, we weren't able to do a Cody or Artie's census or puffin census this year, which was a bit of a bummer. But just for perspective, for people that aren't familiar with Seal Island, this is the largest tern colony in the state of Maine, with around 1,300 pairs of Codys, and usually last year we had around 800 pairs of Arctic terns. And from what I could tell, the numbers were probably pretty similar to that this year, but maybe a little bit higher, just based off of what we were seeing in our productivity plots. It seemed like a bit higher number than usual, but not by too much. And then for puffins, we also were not able to do a census, but we still did our razorbill census the best we could, which I think is pretty accurate. Our razorbill colony continues to increase. We had at least 79 burrows. My guess is it's probably somewhere in the mid 80s, which just continues this rapid increase on Seal Island, at least over the past 10 years or so. Getting into, and then for the cormorants, we have at least 27 pairs of great cormorants nesting on the island. And as Sue mentioned earlier, it's the largest great cormorant colony in the state of Maine, and we're hoping to see it continue to increase. We saw some promising numbers of young great cormorants, presumably last year's chicks, hanging around the island, especially early on and the end of May and the beginning of June. I think our highest count was probably around 8 of them, which doesn't sound that high, but in previous years, we have not seen really any hanging around, maybe 1 or 2 at the very most. So it was nice to see that. And John Drury also told me that he saw young birds hanging out around various islands in Penobscot Bay, as well as on Matinicus Rock early on. And then we had around 26 pairs of double-crested cormorants as well, which both of those numbers seem relatively normal compared to the past several years. So for productivity, our terns didn't do great. Clutch size was a bit low, which I think really helped contribute to the lower productivity numbers. Common terns, we had 0.68 for our productivity. Pretty much all the bee chicks died, seemed like of starvation, and then there's a bit of a weather event at the end of June and beginning of July, a lot of fog and some wet conditions that I think just helped them along. Going along with that starvation. And then the same thing happened with Arctic terns pretty much. And then for puffins, our productivity was pretty good. It's going to be, it's still tentative, but it's going to be around 0.85-ish probably. They seem to do pretty well early on, especially the bulk of the birds that hatched early. And then the chicks that hatched later just don't seem to be getting a lot of weight on them. It seems like we have birds fledging now that are well under 300 grams. So that's not great to see, but I was happy that our birds earlier did pretty well. And our razorbills, this is the first year that we've done a pretty comprehensive razorbill productivity on Seal Island, and it was 0.58. So I don't really know how that compares to past years since we just don't have the numbers, but I think it's maybe around average or a little under average compared to Matinicus Rock. For food, the terns were bringing in quite a bit of hake early on, and then that kind of petered out and we started getting more invertebrates. Hake was 41% and 31% for Arties and Codys, respectively. Arties ate a fair number of euphausids and stickleback, and Codys had a little over 10% of their diet was stickleback. Cody's also were finding herring, but Arctic terns just weren't. Commons were eating about 10% of their diet was herring overall, and Arctics are only 1%. And I've seen that in past years here too, so I always find that pretty interesting. For puffins, our puffins were eating a lot of haddock. That seemed to be overwhelmingly the most common prey item. But when we break it down to percentage over the course of the whole year, just by the number of individuals, it was around 54% of the diet, and then hake was around 30. But when they were bringing in hake, they were typically smaller hake, and they weren't very big. So most bill loads were really haddock. We didn't see tons of butterfish. It ended up at 4% of the diet. And there was a little bit of sand lance and redfish around towards the end when diet started getting more diverse, and it seemed like haddock was really dying out in terms of the percentage in their diet. For gulls, we were still able to do some gull control early in the season. We did a census and destroyed some nests around the middle of June. We destroyed 154 herring gull nests and 25 blackback nests. And then throughout the season, we targeted any birds that seemed to be predating our tern chicks. And we shot 7 herring gulls and 1 blackback gull. I'm also happy to report that we had no laughing gulls nesting on the during the season. And there really just were not many around. I think our high count for the season was maybe 5 or 6. And previous years recently, we had as many as 50 or 60 hanging around towards the western head and some of the meadows down at that end of the island, but really not any this year, so that was good to see. In terms of other predation, we had a daily peregrine falcon that continues to today. And I'm also happy to report that we haven't seen an eagle since the beginning of June. Though, as some of you know, when we arrived on the island on the 17th, we found an eagle nest on one of our taller platforms, which also houses some solar panels. So they kind of cuddled up in there and they started to build a nest. There was no eggs. We think it might have been a younger pair. The nest was initiated in the beginning of May, according to John Drury. But once we arrived, they quickly departed the island, and we saw them for maybe a week on and off after that, but then they really never came back again. And I guess the last thing I'll touch on is our guillemots. We don't really do a census, but we did our normal productivity for them, and it looks like it'll be about 0.09, which seems okay for guillemots here. It's pretty good. But I will say that it seemed like a lot of chicks were fledging at relatively low weights. Some nested better than others, but I wasn't thrilled with the weights. A lot of chicks were under 300 or around 300 grams, and I would have liked to see it a little bit higher for them. So I think I'll leave it at that, and I think we can get to some questions if there are any. It looks like we have a couple.
Yeah, Keenan, why don't you go ahead and mention the issue around term census and getting that done this year?
Yeah, we just weren't able to do a census because at the time of the GOMSWG window, there was only 2 people on the island. So a turn census just didn't happen this year. It was going to be way too much disturbance to do it with just 2 people. So we thought it was the best for the birds just to leave it for this year. Then I see one from Lauren about trapping of Arctic terns and puffins. We were able to trap Arctic terns this year. We got to our goal of trapping 100 adult Arctic terns during the incubation period, which was good. And we were able to band a lot of puffin chicks. We banded over 150 puffin chicks this year. And we didn't really target trapping any puffins, adults, but we did a lot of band resighting, and we were really successful with Arctic terns. I don't know exactly the numbers, but we probably resighted close to 500 bands of Arctic terns and maybe 300 or so puffin bands. So we had a really good year in terms of bands, trapping, and resighting. Yeah.
Keenan, go ahead and address Steve's question about eagles.
Yes. So Steve mentions he thought that it was an unusually late initiation date for eagles this year, and he was wondering if they're still showing any juvenile feathers. And if they return, they may start much earlier next year. So from the observations we made, there was no indication of any juvenile feathers. We looked at them pretty closely. They just seemed like full adults to us. So we were wondering if maybe it was their first year of breeding, or if they had failed at another location and then moved to Seal. They did try to nest on one blind platform. Actually, you can see it on the picture in the slide. We call it Benedict Tower. It houses the seal camera here, the gray seal camera in the winter. And then you can see those solar panels on the side of it, and it kind of creates a nice little nook and a raised area for the eagles to nest. They've never tried in past years, but this coming year we're hoping to put some sort of deterrent on top of all the platforms on the island, which will hopefully keep them away. And it's still in discussion what the best method will be for that. So maybe it could be a discussion point later on in the meeting.
Keenan, I have a question about cormorants. It's exciting to hear you mention a few more great cormorant subadults around early in the season. Hopefully that implies some good overwinter survival of last year's birds. Do you see double-crested subadults around ever? Does that follow a similar pattern, or is that probably disconnected?
We do see them, but I think it seems to be a bit harder just to figure out. Like, so where the cormorants are loafing most often, where we can see them best from the island itself and not being on a boat, is looking at an area that mainly is great cormorant loafing zones. So it's hard to say. I just don't feel confident saying that it's the same pattern. They could be there and just out of view with where the double-crested cormorants are nesting, but I just don't really know. We do see them around throughout the summer, foraging around the island and occasionally loafing with the great and double crests, but it's really hard to say. And there's so many more transient double crests migrating by, and it seems like some migrants will occasionally stop by. But since they seem to migrate a bit later than the great cormorants and settle into the island later, it's a bit harder to tell, I think.
Yeah. We have a question from Pete about the effect of the peregrine flights. Could you speak to that?
Sure. So here we get peregrines pretty much every year. It's very consistent. There's not much we can really do about it. They tend to take, most of the days they usually come at least once, but sometimes up to 3 or 4 times through the colony. I think the most that we saw them take was 3 individual birds in a day. But they tend to take their kills and loaf on the high cliffs on the east-facing sides of the island that make it pretty much inaccessible for us. So they just take as many as they can, it seems like. And I would guess that they probably, over the course of the summer, they probably took 40 or 50 or more fledglings and maybe 30 adults, but that's a really rough guess. I don't know. But they were around every day, and from when the terns settled in until now, with only a few days that seemed quiet. But I will say, I guess, on top of that is it has never seemed to affect them settling in again for the night. They always just seem to go right back to their nests and chicks, and we've never seen any nocturnal abandonment or anything here. And it's nice to be able to confirm that with the cams that we have on the island. You can see the terns settling in and roosting again for the night.
All right. I don't see any more questions. So thanks, Keenan. Why don't we move on? And we're hoping to get another report from the island for Matinicus Rock.
Hello? All right.
Hello, Kayla.
Hi.
Yeah,
So this year we didn't get out to the island until June 13th. So that meant by the time we got here, we had some puffin chicks, and we weren't able to do our tern census, and we didn't do any tern trapping as well. But for our Arties, their productivity was 0.71, which was a little on the low side, but it's just under the long-term average, which is 0.72. And then for our Coaties, we had 0.86 for productivity, which is a little lower than before, but right around the long-term average as well. Because we didn't do the census, we don't know for sure with our lapingos, but we do have a lot more this year. When we got here, there was already some breeding, and we oiled some nests, and we oiled up to 79 nests. So it's quite a few more than previous years. Last year, they had a total of 11 nests. Yeah, we tried to do a little bit of deterring, but it wasn't really successful. And we did kill a few adults, but it didn't deter anyone else. Then going to, I guess the common mirrors are on there. 2 burrow sites that we checked for our common mirrors, and we saw at most 12 eggs. And we think we had about 7 chicks that fledged, but we could have had more. It's just a little hard to say. And then for our puffins, I don't know if there's another slide for that, or I'll just keep going. So for puffins, productivity yet, just because we still have quite a few puffins out there, puffin chicks. But what I can say is the chicks that fledged already, they seem to be at a fair weight. They were over 300 grams, about 130 wing cord. But the puffins that we still have, I don't think they'll be quite as high of a weight, but we'll see. We've had quite a drop in food and a lot of butterfish. So we'll have to wait and see for those guys. For the top prey items for the season, we had mostly haddock, about 43% was haddock. And then we had some hake at around 39%. So that was really the majority of what we were seeing. And then butterfish was up to 6% this year, which is quite high. And then for our razorbills, our productivity was 0.57 young fledged per nest. So that's a bit lower than the past 3 years, which was sitting around 0.64. And for them, they were eating mostly hake. We got 71% hake for their diet, and about 13% herring, and then some haddock and sand lance. So they seem to do okay. And other than that, we have our Manx burrows that we checked. So we still have 6 active breeding burrows, which is what we had last year. We do know that 1 chick, though, has already died. It died as a small chick, but we still have 5 chicks as far as. And then we don't have our gilly prod or storm petrel prod yet, just because we still have chicks. With our gillies, we did have like 2 heavy downpours in early July, and that seemed to have an effect on the gillies. We did have some of our burrows where the eggs were wet and rolled, and we had just a few chicks that were wet and found dead. So it might not be a huge impact, but we did notice that with the gillies. And then for other predation, we have 2 ravens that have been hanging out on sort of the north tip of the island. And as far as we can tell, they seem to be targeting razorbill and guillemot eggs, but we haven't really observed anything from them. And we also have had a peregrine falcon as of late, which does flush the terns, but they do, like it sounds similar to seal, where they do come back quite quickly. And we've only seen them actually take out 2 terns, but it's hard to say how much predation that the peregrine is causing. And then we've had, well, we had a lot of foggy weather in June and July, and so that may have had an impact on some of our gull predation. We did see a blackback take a chick once, and we did have some herring gulls fly through the tern colony, but we didn't actually see any predation from them. And then we did kill just a handful of herring gulls and blackback gulls, but most of them were found injured. So we had a lot of gulls that were showing up with broken wings mostly, and they were kind of hanging around the tern colony. And that's pretty much us. We saw a city tern, which was really cool. And I think that's a wrap.
That's great. We have at least one question for you. Did you do periodic counts of the MERS? And if so, what was your high count?
We didn't do a high count. So what we would have from the mirrors is just our morning counts, which I don't think we ever got too high. I can't recall the number. I think it was somewhere like 40 or something around there. But yeah, unfortunately, we didn't do a high count this year just due to time.
Right. Another question from Lauren. What were the terns eating this year? And did you see any unusual prey in the diet of puffins?
So for terns, we saw mostly hake for both species. So the Arctic terns, 35% was hake, and then it was amphipods and euphasids, and just a little bit of herring and some mixed fish. We did see 20 different prey items with them, so there was quite a variety, but only 6% was maybe hake or herring, and down to 1.3% of herring. And then for coaties, they had a bit more of just mixed fish. So they had 37% hake, and then it was about 12% pollock. Then next after that was actually stickleback with 8%. And then it was just hake and herring and just some mixed fish. For anything abnormal with them, we did see some goose barnacles coming in with the Arctic tern chicks. And we did actually see one of the chicks eat that, but it was definitely not preferred. And we did find some piles near the nest sites of those little barnacles. And for puffins, unusual prey items, we saw some sari in the beginning of the season, and we had a little bit of squid, and we had one goosefish or one goose barnacle that came in with a puffin, which was quite unusual, and we did have some goosefish.
When was the sooty seen on the rock?
That was quite recently.
Just after the hurricane.
It was just after the hurricane blue flew, and it was hanging out with our terns here on the rock for an evening.
Yeah, probably similar to some sooties being seen inland in Massachusetts, I believe. One of those neat storm accidentals. And then a question from Steve, which I'm going to fine tune a little bit. He was asking about the decline in food for puffin chicks coinciding with a recent increase in sea surface temperature. That sea surface temperature really started climbing in much of the Gulf in late July. I'm wondering, when do you think food started slowing down for puffins? Similar, or was there a lag at all, do you think?
I think it was pretty similar. We haven't gone through all of that, but it seemed to be fairly similar in timing.
Okay. Keenan added a mention that they also on seal saw goose barnacles in Arctic tern chick diets. Actually, he's saying 3.5% of Arctic tern diet, which is really kind of amazing. I think that covers it for questions. So thanks very much for the live island report, and we'll move on.
Hi everyone, this is Emma from Matinic Island, and I was one of 2 technicians on the island this summer. We did our census on June 17th. We counted 910 tern nests, and with a correction factor estimated a total of 1,019 nests. And we calculated a species ratio of 62 common terns, or 630 pairs, and 38% Arctic terns, or 389 pairs. And this is actually a record for the island. It's 177 more pairs than the previous high count, which was in 2018. Our productivity for common terns was 0.8, and for Arctic terns was 0.96, which is a little bit lower than previous years. We suspect that was due to the extended fog events in late June and early July, and then possibly less available food than in 2019. For provisioning, the most common fish items we saw being delivered to common terns and Arctic terns were herring and hake. We also saw more inverts being delivered to Arctic terns, but these were primarily fed to one of our provisioning nests. We saw a slight food shortage in the end of July with more butterfish being brought in, but the chicks we observed were able to eat the butterfish. In terms of predation, we calculated 3.8% early season predation rate out of 130 monitored nests. We had a peregrine falcon that was visiting the island in June and late July, and we also had a merlin that visited almost every day from late June until late July, that we suspect may have been nesting on the island. We also have eastern garter snakes that are a predator of tern, eggs, and chicks, and we captured and released on the mainland 42 this season. During our eider and gull census at the end of May, we oiled 207 herring gull nests and 2 great backpack gull nests, and we lethally removed 3 herring gulls. We also we found 46 guillemot burrows this season, and we counted 36 common eider nests during our census in conjunction with the gull census at the end of May. And that is all I have right now. I'll see if there's any questions.
Thanks, Emma. We do have a question about the garter snakes. How do you catch those?
Yeah, so we were catching them just by hand. In the beginning of the season, we actually are experimenting with new methods. Towards the end of the season, we actually were using minnow traps to see if that would be effective. We put out 4 minnow traps in the colony, and we did catch 1 snake, so that could be a method that we use in future years. But primarily it was just catching them by hand.
Mm-hmm. I'll ask a question. I'm curious how the terns respond to the merlin. And how disturbing is that compared to, say, a peregrine?
Yeah, so for the merlin, we would see partial dread, just where the merlin was in the colony, with terns hovering and diving the merlin, whereas opposed to the peregrine, the entire colony would dread and chase the peregrine. So there was definitely disturbance, but it was more located to where the merlin was, and the entire colony didn't dread. It was just partial.
Great. Another question about the garter snakes from Steve. Do you know what they eat, and do you have any idea what the total number of snakes has been over the years?
Yeah. So. Oh, sorry.
He also has a suggestion to lay out flat boards like plywood, for example, to attract them. You can then lift the boards up and access the snakes underneath oftentimes.
Yeah, definitely. We documented evidence of the snakes. We actually found one snake eating a savanna sparrow chick, and we also found them eating dead chicks. And as far as the total number of snakes, we started removing snakes in 2011, and since then we've removed, let's see, 318 snakes, I believe. And yeah, that is a good suggestion. We've tried laying out black plastic to see if that would be effective. And we found more just by incidental sightings, but I'm not sure that is something we could try.
Yeah, so this is Linda. We're hoping, I've watched way too many YouTube videos about trapping snakes and what to do with snakes, and that's where we learned about the minnow trap. So I'm hoping we can maybe use some drift net fencing early in the spring when maybe they've gone up into the forest to winter, and then try to intercept them back down when they're coming back down to the colony by using the minnow traps and the drift nets to funnel them into the trap. So yeah, over 300 snakes removed, but I did read that snakes can have up to like 75 young. So that's kind of motivated me to ramp up our control efforts.
Linda, do you bait the minnow traps?
Yeah, so it recommended using unwashed eggs, which we did initially. So we used unwashed chicken eggs from Michael's Chickens. But then I wonder how that works after any rain event or something, because it seems like then the smell would be gone. You know, they recommended using like frogs or amphibians, but it didn't seem like that would work really well since we don't have them on the island. And there are people who sell snake lure. I'm not sure if that's really just a hoax or not, but I'm gonna buy some and we're gonna try it. So we're open to any and all suggestions from people who might have experience trapping snakes.
Yeah, what I'm familiar with at a tern colony in China, it is traps very similar to a minnow trap. The snakes actually have to push the funnel open to get in, so there's no way they can get out once they're in, and they're baited with eggs. And that's been pretty effective for larger snakes there. So. Okay,
great.
Yeah, Becky's asking, why are garter snakes a problem here and not other islands? I guess, do we know anything about why they're present here and not elsewhere?
No, I mean, we have observed them on other islands off the coast, and people have observed them swimming, 10 miles offshore. So they're capable of getting out to our other islands, but as far as I know, this is the only managed tern colony where we've had a large garter snake population, and we have observed them eating tern eggs in the past. And again, the crew mentioned that they found them eating dead tern chicks, so we just don't know if this is a more significant issue than we're aware of. So we're trying to reduce the population, at least in the tern colony part of the island. But this is a 300-acre island. We own half of it, and there's a large flock of sheep. So we don't know if they, got brought out there at some point. Maybe if people brought out feed for the sheep or something. I'm not sure. But when I started at the refuge, they were some of the largest garter snakes I've ever seen in my life, like 3 feet long and 2 inches thick. They weren't the little 18-inch garter snake that you see at your house. It was like, holy smokes, these are big snakes.
Wow, that's impressive. We have another suggestion from Emily for something to lay flat on the ground, and that's sheet metal. I suspect you're thinking of maybe the corrugated or ridged roofing sheet metal. I've seen that used pretty effectively as a way to lure them into sunbathing spots as well. That's a good thought. Any other questions for Matinik? I'm not seeing any, so thanks very much, Emma, and we'll move on.
Hi everyone, this is Kay from Egg Rock. So we also were operating on a smaller crew. We started out with 2 people, which turned to 3 in the beginning of July. We were able to conduct a Cody census and also a Lagu census on 6/15. And our census numbers were 1,156 Cody nesting pairs. And then Arties we counted by census window on June 20th, which was 77, and then Ross, we counted 80 nesting pairs. A little bit about the Cody prod estimate. You can see that it's a range. So the number to the left, 0.28, is excluding chicks that disappeared after day 15, which is typically how you would do it, but we had such a high number of chicks disappear after day 15 that we also included another estimate of prod, which would include those chicks, and that's the higher end of the range, 0.64. Overall, our prod, if you look at the lower end, that's lower than the last 20 years, and if you look at the higher end, that's lower than the last 15 years. So overall, our prod was not very good, and I'll talk about this more a little bit later, but it was perhaps driven by the rainstorms at the end of June, as well as heavy fog events, which some of the other islands have been talking about. Our Artie prod was 0.6, which is also rather low, and I should mention we didn't actually do a prod this year. We did a more hatch success kind of measure, and that was because of reduced staffing. 0.6 is rather low as well, and was potentially driven by a predator that we have not seen on egg before, which was a mallard family that was going around and taking turn eggs, and I will talk about that a little more later. Our Rosia prod was actually rather good at 1.58, and we think that that's probably partially due to where they were nesting, which was mainly out of the elements and away from the gull predation that we saw a lot of this season. In terms of diet, I would say we saw something fairly typical. Codys were bringing in 47.8% hake and 30.2% herring. Roseates were flipped, but the numbers were very similar, so 39.5% herring and 38.7% hake. And roseates were also bringing in a bit of pollock. We did start an Artie feeding study, but because of predation events and weather, and this mallard family that was circling the perimeter of the island, we only had about 12 observation hours, because by the end of it, all the chicks had either died or the eggs had been taken. So the numbers that I'm about to read are based on a smaller sample size. So Artie diet consisted of primarily hake at 87.5, which seems rather high. And then we also saw them bringing in some soury and fish scraps at about 6.3%. Yeah, so I'll move on to Lagus now. We did our census on the 15th as well as the 20th. That's when we finished it up, and we got 1,174 nests. We oiled all of those, and that number is quite an increase from last year, which was around 330. And then the year before, we found 1 nest. So it has been increasing over the last couple of years. However, that number is still quite a bit lower than the census numbers previous to those last couple of years when we were trying new hazing techniques. Moving on to the guillemots. So our prod this year was 0.71 and clutch size average was 1.89. Not totally sure what led to some of the mortality here. We did see a couple nests washed out at the beginning of the season. as well as some dead chicks of sort of unknown causes. I suspect that it's probably that mortality was probably due to a combination of the weather events, it being a bad food year, and maybe starvation because of the amount of klepto that was happening this year with the increased laughing gull population. We also managed to get in a storm petrel hatch success survey. We surveyed 3 plots and found or monitored 74 nests, which is quite a bit higher than last year and higher than the year before as well. And our hatch success number was 0.49, which is lower than those last 2 years. And would suggest a decreasing trend, but that could just be due to the increased sample size. So we might just be getting a more accurate estimate of hatch success on the island. As for puffins, we observed feeds to 173 burrows, which is lower than the last 2 years. Although I would venture to say that that could be more due to our sampling effort or our observation effort than an actual estimate of the number of active burrows on the island this year, because during peak hatch, peak chick rearing, we only really had 2 people surveying across the entire island, which has quite a few blinds where we need to get access to see those burrows. We were able to grub 19 chicks, and the ones earlier on the season seem to be doing rather well, which I guess is consistent with what some of the islands are saying about their puffin prod. More recently, we found 2 chicks that were too small to band, and like the other islands, which have a more accurate estimate of this, we suspect that those may not fledge due to their weights being pretty low in spite of their advanced age. Our first feed was on May 30th as well, which would suggest that the puffins are starting to feed a bit earlier, which is great, or starting to hatch a bit earlier, which is great. And their diet, we got 65.1% hake and 22.2% haddock, which is fairly typical in terms of order, but the haddock number is quite a bit higher than the past few years, which is really interesting. It's about 3 or 4 times higher than in past years. So not totally sure the meaning of that, but I suppose it's a good thing if they were able to feed their chicks with it. And then I want to touch briefly on gull control again. So we had an increased amount of lagoos on our island this year, but I would say probably the primary threat was were a variety of predatory herring gulls, which took occasionally up to 8 chicks a day. At least one day we observed that. And the herring gulls, I would say, drove that prod number really low for Cody's and Artie's as well. And we made attempts to cull herring gulls. We were able to shoot 3. 2 more adults washed up onto the island dead, or actually were found in boulder crevices dead, which is suspicious. And we suspect that maybe they were trying to access guillemot burrows, because on occasion we also saw them take guillemot chicks. And yeah, back to the mallard really briefly. So we actually observed a mallard family. It was a mother and 3 chicks that were, I don't really have experience determining mallard age, but they must have been at least a couple weeks old. And we saw them tearing apart tern nests in sequence. So like one right after another in the cabin area, but also based on our observations of them around the island, we suspect that they were predating island-wide. So it would be interesting to follow that next year and see if that's going to become a trend out here. So yeah, good year for team morale, bad year for for bird hatch. Any questions? Oh, here.
Yeah, okay, we've got one from Pete about the hatch date.
Yeah, the early hatch date of puffins on egg rock seems like about a full week before historic data from past decades. No, a week seems like it's noteworthy. Yeah, so we agree with that. Last year, the hatch date, or the first feed, because that's how we determine hatch date out here, was one day earlier, May 29th. So we're continuing that trend of it pushing earlier. And I think you would probably have to have a little more a greater sample size of dates to really say what's happening, but it would suggest a trend, and I think that would be a good thing. Did you oil Lagu eggs or break up nests? So before census, we broke up nests, and we broke up about 332 nests, I believe. And then later on in the season during census, actually, we oiled every nest we came across, which ended up being 1,174. I think I missed this. Were the Lagu back on egg, or was this on Western egg? The Lagu were back on egg this year. We were unable to conduct a census on Western egg, which would be really interesting to do in the future. And I know that the project has been attempting to do that to see what kind of movement there is between the populations. Yeah, hopefully that will be something we can get back to doing in the future, and also maybe employing some attraction techniques over on Western egg for the gull populations.
Lauren, I can add to that we did boat around Western egg rock. I guess that would have been early July, and saw very little laughing gull activity there from the water. So it does appear that, you know, as Kay has suggested, that much of these birds in this bay have moved back to Eastern egg.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see how much go-between there is between the populations, and how easily the populations on Western egg can access our colony here on Eastern egg, I guess.
I don't see any other questions. I would like to direct everyone to the chat who is not signed in. We have a Google Doc that's where we're trying to collect the names of everyone who joins the meeting today. And a link to that doc is at several points throughout the chat. So if you haven't signed in, please do so, so we can track that. And then we'll go ahead and move on. Thanks so much, Kay, for that report. And we'll move on to Michael and a report from Tom.
Thanks, Don. So, yeah, we'll just go right into it. We were able to complete we got out to the island May 26th, which is a little later than we usually have, but I don't think it greatly affected the season. We did our turn census on June 17th, and we had an estimated 1,453 Cody nests, which was quite in excess of last year's numbers, which was 1,159, and that was a record-breaking year. So our Codys are definitely getting an upward trend across each season. The Artie nests, during census, there were only 3 active at the time, but by the end of the season, we had counted a total of 9 nests. I feel like a number of the later nests we found were relays, because at any given time, we had 5 Artie nests present on the island. And also, given the number of Arties we saw loafing on the intertidal, I feel that's probably a better estimate of how many breeding pairs we had. Rosies, we only had 2 active nests. One we actually knew of during census. The second one we had located during the census, and then with hatch date realized of the chick, we realized that it was actually present during GOMSWG. So we had 2 nests. Both of them managed to fledge their A chicks. One hatched a B that had a low day 2 weight of 14.8, and it did subsequently perish on day 6. The other nest had a pipping the egg, but wound up stalling after a few days and a bout of rain. Interesting thing is the one banded roseate breeder that we were able to locate was a P16 red that was at the exact same location it was last year. So I feel like that was a interesting little bit of information. Just going back to the top in terms of prod. Prod was Steve, I think I definitely misquoted you in lower prod earlier. during an earlier conversation. Our birds did a little bit better. We had a prod of 0.76, although that is much lower than it's been in previous years. Previous year numbers have been 1.41 and 1.28 in the previous 2 seasons. I associate a number of things attributed to that. By and large, we had more of a boom and bust in terms of our productivity plots. We lost almost an entire productivity plot to abandonment down in the dunes area, and we lost an entire feeding study very early on during that late June weather. Most of the chicks just went missing, and the few remaining eggs were abandoned. Let's see, clutch size was right about where it's been historically, at around 2 eggs per nest. Arties, again, productivity. I feel like productivity was artificially lowered due to the great number of abandoned nests we had. In sheer number of fledged chicks, we fledged 4 of the 5 artie chicks that did hatch. So I feel like that was some good news. What else did we have? In terms of feedings, sand lance and herring made up the vast majority of our Cody diet which was about 72% collectively, sand lance just beating out herring. As the season went on, we definitely got a more diverse number of species being brought in. A few interesting things. Right towards the very end, we saw a good deal of mackerel being brought in, which I've not seen fed to Cody's before. The butterfish, we definitely had that late season influx of butterfish, which I think primarily contributed to the beach chick starvation. Observed butterfish was made up, what do I have here? Sorry. I think it was about 1.4% of the diet, which is about 3 times what it was last year. Weather, I know we had that, like I said, everyone's mentioned we had that late June, early July weather, and that was a thought I had in terms of like if that would affect fledging success. And it actually turns out they had twice as much rain last year on pond as we did this year, but as some people have mentioned, the timing of it is more than likely a more important factor than the sheer volume of water we had. That's about it in terms of the species. It says more or less a single species study island. Yeah, predation. Predation was almost exclusively a result of the peregrine falcon, and the peregrine made very, very frequent visits to the island. Early in the season, it would show up every couple of days, and it seemed like it was coming either directly down from the Kennebec River or from more directly north in the mainland. But it very quickly began to make daily visits, and that quickly gave way to multiple visits a day, and it was not infrequent to have almost continuous visits throughout the morning and better portion of the day. We found the birds, the PFAS they stopped going upriver and back towards the mainland, and had frequently either would perch over on neighboring Wood Island, or we also discovered that they would take their kills down to the southern point, and Emily was able to actually locate their preferred feeding spot, which was back on the further southern ridge of the spine. And they took they took a lot of birds. Unfortunately, I found that I'd say about maybe half of the birds that they took were dropped. I think I quote Steve anywhere in a very, very rough estimate of maybe somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 80 birds taken throughout the season. But again, that's a hard estimate to really nail down. A lot of that comes from the birds we've seen taken, kills found on the beach. They definitely, earlier in the season, there was a preference for the adults, but they did which hunting the fledglings, especially off of the landing. They was lucky. We didn't have trouble flushing the birds, and they were very quick to leave whenever we approached them down on their southern end. But whenever we did, they seemed to just make a pass through the colony and eventually leave. More or less kind of came and went as they pleased. We did have a couple of days of herring gull predation around mid-July, and it seemed to really be primarily the result of two individual birds. And there was one day in which I believe we saw, I think, what, 3 or 4 fledglings taken off a landing. But luckily, given the timing, which anyone who knows pond is very difficult to take gulls due to its proximity to the mainland and everything. But between the tide and where the bird chose to loaf, we were able to take one of the individuals. And after that, there was no, we observed no further gull predation on it. In terms of blackbacks, the only birds we've seen taken by the blackback gulls were either kills or drops by the people. There's no direct predation from them on the codes. Let's see. Yes, I know someone mentioned the use of the agra laser, and it's had its primary effectiveness is in inclement weather during dusk and dawn and foggy weather. And I wanted very much for this thing to be effective, especially over past use over previous years. But ultimately, I feel like its effectiveness is very, I don't want to say minimal, but you need just the right conditions in order for it to be effective. Both for gulls and the PIFA, we found just simple shouting or approaching the birds had a much better effect than the actual use of the laser. The birds either completely disregarded or acclimated to fairly quickly.
Michael, we have a question from Linda. Did you have any owl issues this year?
No, just like last year. It seems like Jenny took our owl, which I have no issue with. Was that spoiler? Sorry. That was Ben's big moment. Yeah. Luckily, there was no owls. We saw, I believe, one owl pellet up on the ridge during when we first opened the island, but it seemed like that was something from over winter. No, I'm sure the question is going to come next too. Absolutely no evidence of any mink predation either, which was surprising because those are, pond's two historic predators, and I saw absolutely no evidence of those. Another thing I want to mention, there was a bout of heavy egg predation, primarily from the dunes, the southern beach area. And we suspect it was probably a combination of crows and gulls preying on the eggs. Unfortunately, we were not really able to get any confirmed sightings, largely due to the fact of just the landscape and where it's difficult to get a good view of the dunes area. We set out game cam over the course of several nights, and the game cam seemed to work in every test outside of actual deployment. So we don't know if it was an issue with where we were putting it, but we got nothing on cam. And by and large, I feel like the dunes area was probably our least successful area of the island. Like I said, it seemed to be overall fledgling success seemed highly reliant on where the birds had chose to nest than to any real trend across the island. Am I missing anything else? No?
I don't think we have any more questions either.
Okay.
So I guess thanks very much, Michael. I guess we'll go ahead and move on.
Oh, the glare's too bad.
Yeah.
Here, just switch things.
Sorry, everybody. I was trying to fix the glare behind me. Okay, I think that looks better. Hello, my name's Ben. Along with Sam Wells, we were the crew on Jenny Island this summer. And I'll just jump right into it. So because of COVID, we weren't able to get onto the island until June 1st, which didn't really impact our season that much compared to last year. It's just a little bit more late setup, but thankfully the first Cody chicken hatched until the 16th. And the 16th was also the date that we did our GOMSWG census. So we had a total of 1,433 Cody nests, which is a decrease of about 200 from last year, but it is still higher than the second highest census count, which was 2018, which had 1,426 nests. And then we also had a count for roseate tern nests at 21, which is the same as last year, which is a small decrease from the highest, which is 24, which is 2018, but is also still a lot better than the lowest point, which was 2015 and 2016, which had 15 and 13 roseate nests respectively. And then we also found one Arctic tern nest during the census, which unfortunately failed at the end of June due to bad weather event. That also affected pretty much every species on the island and also every other island too, which I'll get into later. But for productivity, common terns, so we monitored total 93 nests of common terns and 21 nests of the Ross. 2 roseate tern nests did not hatch. But for Cody prod, the mean clutch size was 2.16, which is higher than last year's, which was 2.12. The mean hatch was 1.89, which is higher than last year's, which is 1.78. But the productivity is 0.67 this year, which is much lower than last year's, which is 1.33. So in other words, for every 3 nests, 2 chicks fledge. And for Ross, the Ross did actually slightly better, or notably better than the Cody's, with a mean clutch size of 1.85, which is higher than last year's, which is 1.76. Mean hatch of 1.38, which is higher than last year's, which is 1.24. And a productivity of 1.05, which is slightly lower than last year's, which was 1.10, but still higher than the Cody's this year, which was 0.67. And as for food, what we can attribute that low productivity to, I'll get into this later. I have a list of causes of mortality, but the lower productivity for Cody's was almost certainly caused by the bad weather event at the end of June, early July, and then also a lack of quality food throughout the season, most notably during the month of July. But as for food, the number one prey of choice for Cody's this year was herring, which constituted 35% of its diet, of their diet. And then hake was number 2 at 18.7%. And then euphacid also made number 3 at 7.4% of their diet. Compared to Ross, which did better in terms of feeding than Cody's, which is interesting enough. The number one prey of choice for roseate terns was 33% of sand lance, which is different from last year, which herring was the number one prey of choice for 2019 at 24.5%. But this year, sand lance took that spot. Number 2, herring came in at 17.6%. And the third most popular prey choice was hake at 16.2% for roseate terns. And so that's the feeding. And then we had a few predation events from different species. So by and large large gulls, such as herring gulls and blackback gulls, were not a huge issue during the season. There was one instance of a herring gull trying to grab a fledged Cody chick, but it ended up being chased away by adult Codys before it could catch it, but it did succeed in wounding that chick's wing, and later that chick became a prey item of a peregrine falcon. So ultimately it wasn't successful there, but didn't really matter. And a great blackback gull actually was very confident when it circled the island and it caught a fledged Cody chick, and it brought it out to sea where it drowned it and then ate it after that, which was pretty frustrating to witness that. But that was about it for large gulls. Laughing gulls did not nest on the island. Oh, I should also mention that we did have one herring gull nest at the beginning of the season. We chased away the parent when we arrived, but it probably did that before we arrived on the island. And we did notice the nest when we did census. And interesting enough, a Cody chick, a Cody pair apparently took over that herring gull nest, and they laid their eggs right next to these giant herring gull eggs, which was pretty interesting. I don't know if that's been seen before. Obviously that nest failed because I couldn't see a Cody parent incubating that size of eggs, but I thought that would be interesting. And for laughing gulls, they did not nest on the island, although that's been a problem in the past. They didn't do that this year. However, they were a significant nuisance to the colony nonetheless, where numbers peaked at 6 to 10 hanging out at the island at any point. And the kleptoparasitism that they induced to the food-carrying adults certainly had an effect on the productivity of the island, given that food was already short and the quality was not that good. So we did end up euthanizing one lagu in late July. However, displaying that carcass didn't really seem to have an effect on deterring other gulls. And in hindsight, we probably should have taken more, but we didn't. And then a significant predator was a great horned owl. He had a mild effect at the beginning of the season. So early in the season, during the few days after we arrived on June 1st, we would notice exclusively on the north side of the island, which is the side closest to land, carcasses of dismembered Cody adult and feather spreads. And at night, the colony abandoned pretty frequently, close to dark and in the dusk. So we attributed that to an owl, and so on the night of the 5th of June, we set out traps to catch an owl, and it was successful the first night without trying. And so we caught, without trying other days, and so we caught an adult great horned owl, which you can see at the bottom right there. And it was unbanded, and interesting enough, we caught it in the exact same spot where a great horned owl was caught last year. There's this dead tree on the north side of the island where apparently is like a favorite spot for owls to roost and eat their prey. So we caught it exactly there, and it was safely transferred off the island, brought to Avian Haven, and then released somewhere else in Maine, which is good. Hopefully it doesn't come back. And then throughout the season, peregrine falcon predation was very heavy. We only identified one individual, which was a juvenile peregrine falcon, and we counted 35 counts of it hitting the island throughout the season, and which peaked around late July, where it would visit the island in multiple days, and it would take multiple prey per day. And attempts to try and deter it, such as the agrilaser, had absolutely no effect. And oftentimes it would visit the island very early before we wake up in the morning, and we would discover a lot of dead either fledged Cody chicks or unfledged Cody chick parts that it would left behind multiple days consistently throughout July. Yeah, and then even though, so black-crowned night heron predation has been a problem in the past, and especially in 2018. It was not observed in 2019. It may have happened in 2020. We noticed pretty much in the same general area, a lot of dead chicks around late June. And these dead chicks had signature puncture wounds on their vent and near that area. And which may have been attributed to night heron. And we tried to do some night stints to try and identify it. However, we had some faulty equipment and we weren't able to continue that. Thankfully, that predation seemed to have ended after June passed. It did not seem to resume, but whether it was a black-crowned night heron, we weren't able to determine. And then ruddy turnstones existed on the island kind of mildly towards the beginning of the season, and several or occasional cracked empty eggshells with bill-shaped holes in them were identified, and those were attributed to ruddy turnstones. However, they were not very common at all. And then we had 9 common eider nests found during the GOMSWG census compared to 4 last year, and then also a mallard nest was discovered. And that is it for our monitored birds. And then to summarize with mortality of the chicks, we banded 176 total chicks. That includes Cody and Ross chicks. And 120 out of these chicks were found dead. So 35.8% of those deaths were attributed to exposure, 44.2% to starvation, 15.8% to unknown, whether they went missing, we weren't able to determine. 3.3% to other, which we had one instance of one appearing to have died from a ventral disease where it was swollen and bloody. And then 2 others that had wounds from adults. And then 0.8% to predation, where we were able to confirm a banded chick was killed by a peregrine falcon. And that is it.
Thanks, Ben. That's great. I see we have a question from Steve. Was there any vegetation management done this year or evidence of aggression between nesting pairs due to crowding?
Yeah, we did do some vegetation management. So towards the end, we removed all the invasive radish from the island that we could find, and then also bull thistle nettle. We tried to remove as much as we could find too. And then that's about it for vegetation management. And then yes, we did see some aggression between nesting pairs due to crowding. I would say that's true, yep.
All right, well, thanks very much. I think we'll move on in the absence of other questions. Thanks, Ben.
All right, yeah, no problem.
OGI.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I'm a bad man. Hi, so my name's Nadia. I was a supervisor of OGI. This is Ayla. She was out there with me this season as well. Yeah, so we started our season about a month later than usual. We started on June 13th, which is actually the same day that Matt Rack got out to their island as well. And we did the census the very next day on the 14th. The 13th was when we had our first Cody chick hatch. So we needed to do our census pretty quick. So we had three people to do the census, and that is less than usual. So we tried a new method of doing it, but unfortunately that resulted in kind of a high Lincoln index, which is why you see a range of our census population. So at the low end, we also only surveyed 14 out of the 22 units of the island due to the lack of personnel. So we were able to extrapolate that data to the whole island, because if you look at just those 14 plots we surveyed, they make up about, I think, 70% on average of the tern population. So with our extrapolation, just without any other corrections, we had 1725 for our nests, which I think is 8 more than last year with corrections. So we still definitely increased in terms of number of Cody nests. If you apply our high Lincoln index, we had 1894 nests. So that's like the high end of our range, what it could possibly be. Realistically, we probably didn't miss so many nests. We probably didn't miss like 164 nests. I think that would be 169 nests. So if you apply an average Lincoln correction index, which is like 1.03, the amount of nests you would get would be 1775. So it's somewhere within that range. So I think that makes us still the largest tern colony in Casco Bay. Sorry, no, yeah, in Casco Bay. Sorry, Jenny. And then I think we're the largest common tern colony in Maine. Correct me if I'm wrong. And then let's see, our prod was pretty low. In fact, it's the lowest it's been in 12 years, since 2008. It hasn't gotten below 1. So it was 0.74 this year. We followed 76 nests. And yeah, a lot of them, I mean, as I'm sure you all have experienced, a lot of them died. So I don't think, we didn't have one nest that had more than 1 chick fledge. So it was not great. Our clutch size was the same as last year. So the tern started out optimistically, but you know, things happen. For our for our black guillemot census, we just found 20 active burrows on the island. We followed 18. So our prod for that was pretty high. I think last year it was also 1.22, which was the highest productivity number since 2008. So this year it's the exact same productivity, which means we're doing pretty good in terms of our black guillemots, and we have been for this year and last year, which is a plus to the season. We only had one, from all of our chicks that hatched, we only had 1 chick die. So, and not all of the chicks fledged by the time we left the island, but due to their like growth rate, we're going to presume that they will fledge. And their clutch size was 1.89. In terms of tern provisioning, we had about a feeding rate of 1 prey item per hour, which is really low compared to the last 2 years, which had 2019 1.73 items per hour and 2018 1.72 prey items per hour. So it was a lot of starvation was happening, which I'll kind of touch on later. It was not a great year in terms of food, as you know, as I've heard from most everyone else as well. Hake made up 29.8% of the observed diet. Herring made up 28.3% of the observed diet, and then 14.2% was either hake or herring. So about 72.3% of the diet was hake or herring, which I think is about average. We also did have gooseneck barnacles being fed during 2 of our feeding stints. And our terns, I mean, the chicks really liked them, I guess, in terms of the fact that they were starving. So they, you know, they ate them, which is better than the nothing they had. We had a couple predators. The biggest predators were the gulls, blackback gulls and herring gulls. We did see a couple of laughing gulls, but I don't think they really had any effect. I don't think they tried. Tried anything. We also had a peregrine falcon as most other islands did, it sounds like this year. We think our peregrine falcon was we think it was like a family unit that was breeding on the Ram Island Light Tower, which is about, I think, 2 miles away from Outer Green Island. Because we did see a juvenile, and then we also saw an adult, and once we saw them at the same time. So they did like staged a big attack on our island. And that was 17 days out of our 56-day season. So that's like 30% of our season had predation. We also had one herring gull nest during our GOMSWG census, which we destroyed. Otherwise, we didn't find any other nests on the island. And when we surveyed Junca Pork, which is about, I think, 1/4 of a mile away, we didn't find any nests on there either. But we did have a lot of gulls throughout the season, and we ended up shooting 2 herring gulls, which it deterred the gulls for a while the first time we shot a gull, but the second time it didn't have much effect, I think. Yeah, we did hear a black-crowned night heron one night. We didn't see any evidence of predation from that. And we also saw some hoverballing, and then we saw an adult turn dead on a nest. So we didn't see any other really big signs of mink predation. That could be possibly what was going on there. In terms of our mortality concern, we had 107 banded Cody chicks. 91 of them died. So the biggest 3 issues that killed them, the first would be the storm on June 29th that wiped out 21% of our colony. Starvation, about 16% of the colony died of starvation, and then 17% went missing. So there's a couple options for that. It might be the predators, might be like gulls taking them, might be the PIFA that took them, might be the night heron, who can say? Or it might be the burying beetles. We have some burying beetles on the island, so if the chicks were small enough, we would notice sometimes like a wing just poking out from the ground. So it was like, if our chicks went missing, sometimes we might see a mouth and be like, oh, okay, they were buried. So we couldn't determine like whether or not they were taken or just buried in the plot if they were small enough. Or we also saw, I think because of like such a slow food year, we saw some of the adults picking up chicks, like sea chicks from other nests, and carrying them out into the intertidal zone, or like off onto the ledge or whatever, which could have been why they went missing too, if they carried them away. Yes, and that's all. Yeah, that's the summary of our island. I see a question that says, how many staff would you normally have for a census? I think we have 5 usually. Yeah. So we had 2 less. So we decided to try. What we tried to do was record individually on our phones as we walked in a line and kind of point out which nests we were counting, and then we would like listen to our own recordings, transcribe it, and add them all together. I mean, it worked pretty well, but there was, I think, 1 recording that got deleted with our Lincoln index, which is why we didn't have all the data, which might have led to some issues there. Yes, so that's what happened there.
Thanks, Nadia. I don't think we have, oh no, we do. We do have another question about the burying beetles. Do you know which species have photos? Know if it's the American burying beetle species?
We do. We do know what species. We did see them a few times. We didn't see them. We only saw the movement of them burying things. We didn't see them obviously when they were burying because they were underground. But we did have some that kept trying to drown in our water bin, which we would have to rescue. I think they're the round neck sexton beetles,
yes.
which Pond also had.
Yes.
Um,
Ironically, at the time, Jenny has the American burying beetles as though they're not
oh,
there.
Jenny
Yeah.
has American burying beetles. So I guess I don't know if our burying beetles are endangered, but Jenny apparently has the American burying beetles. And I do have some pictures of ours, and I think Pond does too if you want them.
All right. Well, thanks very much. I think we'll keep moving. And we'll get to Stratton, where we'll get another report from an island.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Rochelle. You sound good.
All right, cool. So I'm Rochelle. I'm the supervisor out here on Stratton this year. We, like a lot of everybody else, had a little bit of a late start, so we got out to the island on June 4th, which impacted some of our work. We were unable to do the census of the wading bird colony, the double-crested cormorant nest count, and an early predator control trip to get the gull eggs on Bluff. But it did not impact our censusing of the tern colony. So we were able to do the tern census on June 14th. Our coding numbers were 1,159, which is lower than both in 2018 and 2019. Our Rossi count is 114 nests that we found on Census Day, which is also lower than 2018 and 2019. But by not quite as much as the Cody's were lower. And then for our Arctics, we had 5 nests that we found on Census Day, but we continued to look for nests throughout the season, and by the end of the season, we had 12 Arctic nests. A few of those we think were relaying, and 1 or 2 were probably nests that we missed when we did census. And we found later on when we saw the Arctics actually sit on those nests. So all in all, lower tern numbers than in the past 2 years, but not huge dramatic shifts in numbers. I'd say the most dramatic shift we had for our terns is that we had no nesting least terns this year. When we showed up, there was no nests. We laid out some decoys in the attempt to bring some least terns to come back to us, but unfortunately those did not work out for us. We did have a high count of 75 loafing adults on the beach on 6/20, but it seemed like they were just kind of coming in to loaf and hang out for the night, and by the morning they were gone, and we never saw them again in such numbers. So unfortunately, no least terns this year. Our productivity for the common terns was 0.76, which is lower than 2019. Like everyone else, I think that was mainly caused by that weather event we had in late June, early July, but we definitely noticed a lot of bee chick die-off and just general bad time for the tern chicks. Roseate chick productivity was 1.16, which is also lower than 2019, but not by quite as much as the Cody numbers again. If we were looking to diet for our common terns, we had primarily sandlance, hake, and butterfish, comprising about 20%, 18%, and 11% respectively. We also noticed a little bit more rosefish feedings for our Codys than usual. I don't have those exact numbers, but we definitely had a few feedings in our feeding studies of the rosefish, and then we just kind of noticed a lot more flying around than usual. Our roseate feeding studies, our chick diet primarily consisted of sandlance and hake at 37 and 17% respectively. For both species, about 40% of our prey could not be identified. We think a little bit because of the veg we had growing really strong this year, it was kind of hard to identify some species. And then also we're all new out here, so it was a little bit of a learning curve for us. But other than that, our chicks did all right. We did have some predation this year. We didn't notice any gull predation, but we did destroy 4 nests here on Stratton and Little Stratton. 3 of them were blackbacks and 1 was a herring gull. We were able to make a trip out to Bluff on 6/27, but unfortunately most of the chicks had hatched at that point and were pretty mobile, though we did destroy an additional 4 herring gull nests that we found with eggs still in them. We also had very minimal night heron predation this year. We only found 2 eggs that we could attribute to the night heron. The first one was on 6/15. It was kind of near the end of the northeastern edge of our colony. And then we didn't see any other night heron predation until 8/1, where our last Arctic nest fell prey to it. But those were the only 2 we saw this year. Like many other people, we did have a peregrine. No, our peregrine did not show up until after a majority of our chicks had fledged. And we only saw him take 1 of our fledged chicks. So he definitely had a roosting point kind of near our eastern gull meadow where I found 2 feather piles. So I would assume that he probably was able to grab a few other terns than what we necessarily saw him take. That was definitely just towards the end of the season, and then he kind of left us, and we've been seeing them on and off since, but we haven't seen them take any other turns. Moving on to some of our other birds, we had 6 active guillemot burrows that we were able to confirm, 5 of them on Stratton and 1 on Bluff. Of the 5 nests on Stratton, we assume that 3 of them fledged chicks just because the last time we saw the chicks, they were pretty big, they weren't downy, and then they weren't in the burrow, so we're hoping they made it out safely to sea. One of our guillemot burrows was new this year, and it was under our Washoe tower. Unfortunately, though, we noticed that they had kicked both of their eggs out of the nest in late August, so we're considering that one as a failed one. And then we had 1 other guillemot nest where the egg hatched, and it was a downy chick that unfortunately perished. So we had 3 successes and 2 failures of the 5 nests here on Stratton. We had a high count of guillemots at 42 on June 27th. So yeah, I think all in all it went all right. And then for American oystercatcher nests, we had 1 that we could confirm, 2 nests that we could confirm, and then 1 nest that we assumed happened. We had a nest next to the Hanafuda blind this year that when we found it had 3 eggs in it. We marked it and we left that side of the blind alone, but unfortunately we noticed that it had 1 egg left in the nest when we did our turn census, and then we saw it be abandoned, so that nest was a failure. We also had them nesting on Little Stratton this year. We never found the nest, but we can confirm that they had chicks because we've seen the chicks with them and all about Little Stratton recently. And then we're assuming we had 1 mother nest kind of on the East Beach side of our island, mostly assuming it based on the behavior of the adults because we were never able to find the nest or the chicks afterwards. But our high count of American oystercatchers this year was 15 on 7/28, so it's definitely a good year for oystercatchers. Yes, just some other exciting bird sightings. We had a sighting of 2 puffins this year on 6/30, which we were all very excited about. And then we also had a razorbill that showed up offshore on 7/4 and 7/5. So Stratton Island's making its play to be an Alcid Island. And that's kind of our consensus of the year. I see we have some questions. How many least turn nests last year? I think it was a little over 100. I'd have to pull that up, and I can do that here in a second.
Actually, Rochelle, I could help out with that. There were 96 nesting during the GOMSWG census window, and over 130 found in total across the entire season.
Nice. Okay, cool. I see a second question about a bee wave of Cody and Rosti nests. We didn't notice a very large bee wave, though we did see a few nests being laid during that period, but we did not follow any of them, so I don't have really concrete numbers. But if I were to wager a guess, I would say it was not a lot of bee nesting occurring this year. Was there habitat loss over the winter for the least terns? I wasn't here last year, so I don't have a huge, I can't really answer that super well. The dune itself is still there, and from what I understand, the habitat looks roughly the same as it did last year. Okay, Zeke is saying that some of the dune grass is gone, so that could have attributed to their deciding not to nest on Stratton this year.
You know, I think we'll shelve the least tern question about where they went. I think we'll learn some more about that here soon. And let's see. I think there is a comment here from Kate O'Brien about fledglings at Basket Island in Biddleford. But maybe I'm getting a little concerned about time. So I think maybe we should probably move on and move on into the next presentation. Thanks, Rochelle.
Sounds good.
All right, we're hoping to get more information on Maine least terns here, but I'm not quite sure who may give this presentation.
Hi, I'm Helen Manning from Rachel Carson National Wildlife Refuge, and I'm going to be sharing this presentation with Francesca Gundrum from Maine Audubon. So I'll start with the Rachel Carson managed beaches. This year we did not have any least terns on Lod Home Farm, which we also did not last year either. This year on Crescent Surf, we did our nest census on June 15th, where we counted 130 nests. And then we did our fledgling counts on July 16th and 29th, where we counted 65 fledglings for that beach. So that gave us a productivity of 0.5, which is a bit higher than previous years, which was nice. Our biggest concerns this year with our least terns on Crescent Surf where we had multiple overwash events. The way the beach was shaped and eroding caused a lot of loss due to the high tide cycles and offshore storm events. So our least terns had to re-nest a few times during this season. And then also later in the season, we had a great horned owl that was preying upon least tern fledglings. So we had about 7 or so fledglings and 1 adult taken by a great horned owl. And throughout the season, we've been working with USDA Wildlife Services on predator management at that beach. So we were able to successfully capture one of those owls and relocate it, no problem. But then the very next night, I had trail camera pictures of another owl. So the second owl we were not able to capture because Wildlife Services was done for the season. We didn't have funding to keep them going. But then shortly after that, our least terns and all the fledglings left anyway, so there were no terns left for the owl to prey upon. And that's the story of Crescent Surf this year. And like I mentioned, Stratton Island didn't have any least terns. And so I'll let Maine Audubon talk about their beaches.
Thanks, Helen. Can anyone hear me?
Yeah, you sound good.
Great. So my name's Francesca Gundrum, and I'm on this year's crew as a biologist and outreach specialist. So I'll keep it short. Obviously, most of what we do is piping plover monitoring, but we were very excited to see 2 leak colonies this year. None at Goose Rocks. We did see 2 or so adults flying around early and some scraping, but no settling. Higgins Beach was definitely our strongest colony. We were able to do a few colony surveys early and had a high count for nests at 131. And in 2019, we had just 21 nests. So this was a jump for us for sure, which is exciting. We were able to do a few fledger surveys over the last few weeks as well. And we're estimating we have about 48 leets that actually fledged off Higgins, which is, again, super exciting. For us, this beach in particular did have an electrified net fence around it, which helped a lot. It also has a really strong volunteer base, which helps to keep dogs and people out of the area, which is really important. And then, yeah, so moving on to seawall. This was also super exciting for us because the last time we had anything up in Phippsburg was in 2016. And there's, high predator loads up at Popham and Seawall, but we did get 6 nests at Seawall Beach on the Morse end. And that strong storm we had a few weeks ago posed an issue for them, as well as limited dune vegetation. So we did put chick boxes out for them to help give them some shade, which helped. But we only got 1 to fledge from Seawall, so obviously hoping for more in the future. But yeah, that's pretty much the summary from Maine Audubon's leets.
Well, that's great. Thanks, both Francesca and Helen. So I guess I'll ask what maybe is a common question. Did Higgins Beach absorb the deficit from Stratton? Would that be the interpretation we might walk away with?
Yeah, I think we're definitely talking about it and discussing that makes sense, since they didn't have any this year and we had a whole lot. So I think we're definitely leaning in that direction. Yeah, so.
Would you attribute that to the electric fence? Did I understand that correctly? That's new this year?
No.
Or it's not new. Do you think there was a difference in human disturbance this spring with people shut up because of the virus?
Yeah, we dealt with this quite a bit, which I'm sure many of those that were anywhere near beaches saw that it's generally a difficult place, obviously, for conservation, but especially this year, I think people found that there was this freedom associated with being on the beach that they could find nowhere else, really. So we had some struggles. I think our volunteers, again, dealt with the majority of that up front, and we had to intervene at some points to help keep them sane. It was a lot of simple things from moving, dozens of spike ball court setups to people throwing balls and frisbees getting into the colonies, and people at night walking through the dunes, and some running into the electric net fence. So again, the volunteers are just awesome and really helped us keep things going. But yeah, so I hope we keep these numbers moving.
All right. I'm not seeing any other questions. And again, in the interest of time, I'll propose we move forward. But definitely thanks, Helen and Francesca. It's great to know that leaf terns had a good year in some places on the mainland. And now we're ready to move further south. We'll depart Maine for New Hampshire.
All right, this is Liz Craig from Shoals Marine Lab. Thank you guys. Really great presentation so far. I'm presenting on behalf of myself and the technicians that were working out at White and Seavey this summer, Alia Caldwell and Beckley Stearns. And I want to give Alia and Beckley an enormous thank you for being up for getting stuck out on White Island for the whole summer. They didn't do any departures from the island this year because of COVID-19. So I myself was also out there for most of the summer, but was able to leave for provisioning. So thanks to Alia and Beckley for doing a phenomenal job. And also a special thanks to UNH and Shoals Marine Lab for helping us to operate or to get approval to operate during COVID-19. Big thanks to New Hampshire Fish and Game and for DNCR, who's the landowner. They all had to come together to help us make this season happen. So we actually got started on time this year. We were only a few days later in our arrival on the island. We got there, I think, May 12th, something around there. A little bit late, but really not by much. And so in terms of our season, we had I'll start with the census. We had a record census for common terns this year. We accomplished the census just with the 3 of us. So again, it's a smaller crew than we normally would have. Typically, we get 7 to 9 people, including us, including 3 full-time staff to do the census. So this year we did it with just the full-time staff of 3. Since we knew we were a smaller crew and it was going to take us a little longer, we spread out the census over 3 days to reduce the amount of disturbance to any one part of the colony for any given time. We also took advantage of our smaller crew and slower pace by adding a spatial data collection component. So we actually ended up getting not only a really good census count, our Lincoln indices were as low as they ever are. But we also managed to GPS every nest on the island. So we have some really cool spatial data that we're hoping to use to look into habitat selection and some questions about nearest neighbors. And anyway, lots of cool opportunities that we've sort of made lemonade out of the lemon of this summer. So yeah, 3,280 common tern nests was up from 2,900 last year. It's the record observed in New Hampshire by only a handful of nests. I think the previous record was 3,210 just a few years ago. So a really good year in terms of numbers of common terns. Arctic terns, we had one nest during the census period, actually one nest for the whole season, which was very similar to what we saw last year. And unfortunately, that pair failed early. In fact, they didn't even hatch any chicks. So this is the second year in a row we've had no productivity, zero productivity for Arctic terns, which is new for us. There's always been, up until now, some Arctic tern productivity, and certainly more than one nest. Since I started in 2016, we would typically have at least 3, maybe 2. So that's definitely a decline. For roseate terns, this was very close to a record for our site. So definitely a high count for us of 96 nests at peak and a total of 108 or maybe 109 over the whole season. So that's a good number for us. Yeah, okay, so that's the census counts. All in all, a very populous year. Lots of birds hanging out on White and Seavey Islands. In terms of productivity, it was a little bit more mixed. The common terns, we monitored common terns within fenced plots as we have for the last 5 years. We monitored 70 nests this season and had an average productivity of about 0.6. That's kind of middle of the road for us. Common terns on White and Seavey tend to be kind of boom and bust, which I believe has a lot to do with the food availability. So this year was kind of middle of the road. And I think that has a lot to do with the same factors that other folks have mentioned at their islands, the unfortunate timing of weather events with stormy and very foggy weather right around peak hatch in late June. And also, I'll mention this now, but I think we saw more large herring, more larger herring than we've ever seen before on this island. So we were seeing large numbers of discarded herring of a size that was a bit too large for most of the chicks to eat. So I think this may have led to some of the mortality of the chicks early in the season. Once the chicks were large enough, if they got past 1 week of age and were able to eat these really big fish, they actually did pretty well. We saw some good growth rates, but I do think that the lack of more suitably sized fish and the presence of a lot of really large fish had to do with some of the mortality of very young age chicks. So that was really interesting. We definitely saw, we collected lots of herring this summer because we had so many discarded. We also observed, just like the folks at Outer Green, we saw common terns carrying chicks away or actually dropping chicks into our productivity plots from time to time. So it's possible that the high density, the really high population count that we observed this year is maybe leading to more competition or aggression amongst terns neighboring one another. So that was probably maybe a substantial source of mortality for really young age chicks as well. But once they got past about a week, we saw really good growth and good survival of older chicks. Our roseate terns had an average productivity of 0.91, which is about average for our island. The productivity for roseate terns is a bit more steady than for common terns from year to year. So 0.91 is about average for us. And again, I already mentioned the Arctic terns had no productivity, zero productivity for this year. In terms of diet, I already mentioned this, the extraordinary unsuitably large herring, which was interesting. We monitored 57 common tern nests for diet. We haven't compiled all the diet data yet, so I can't give you a detailed breakdown, but I would say that we observed a greater diversity of fish species than I've seen out here in recent years. I mentioned a larger herring. We also observed, there was one of the other islands that saw this, I'm sorry, I can't remember which, but an upsurge in mackerel, relatively large mackerel, late in the season, pretty much in August. And the day we left, we saw, I think, 5 discarded mackerel just on White Island, which has very few terns. So that was interesting. We also saw an influx of Atlantic moonfish just after the hurricane came in. The following day, we were finding moonfish discarded all over the colony, obviously distinguishable from butterfish, despite their very similar general shape, and generally discarded because, again, they're kind of butterfish shaped, not very suitable for terns. So that I thought was really interesting and something we've never seen before. We also saw more squid this season than we've seen before. So again, a lot of interesting diversity, lots going on in terms of diet that's slightly different than the past, but certainly lots of herring coming in, for better or for worse, in terms of their size. And then I want to mention we're continuing to partner, as I know many of the other islands are, with Dr. Gemma Klukas, who's at the Cornell Lab of O, doing the DNA metabarcoding of feces for tern diet. So we were really lucky to get approval for Gemma to come out for a short stint with us this summer. So in addition to collecting data early in the season, Gemma was able to come up and collect data and do some paired observations visually and in terms of fecal data collection. So extra thanks to Gemma for lending a hand. In terms of predation, some of you might remember we had a big issue with muskrats last year, and we have had issues with muskrats in the past. This year, we saw very few muskrats. We trapped 2 of them just to keep the den on CV Island at bay. But really no major issues with muskrats this season. Gulls were the major predator that we were contending with, and that's the case at our colony every year. We have large island neighbors, including Appledore and Star Island and Smutty Nose. And which have large populations of herring gulls and great blackback gulls. This year, it felt like there was a substantial uptick in the amount of predation pressure. I'll have to tally all the numbers, but we had a lot of predation pressure from gulls. And I believe it's likely due to the lack of human presence or highly reduced human presence on Appledore and Star Islands. Star Island, which is the island just north from us, typically is an active hotel during the summer, and this year was closed down due to COVID-19. So I imagine that the gull activity had an upsurge there. And the same goes for Appledore. There were a handful of staff, just a skeleton crew on Appledore this summer, as opposed to our normal bustling academic community with, sometimes 100 students at a time. So it's possible that that has something to do with our increased level of gull predation. We did lethally remove 2 blackback gulls and 2 herring gulls. And one of each of those species was injured and hanging out on the colony just up to no good. So that was it in terms of lethal removal, but we did a lot of hazing and pyrotechnics. We, as with everyone else, had visitors from a peregrine falcon throughout the season, and this is typical for our island as well. It was not, we had 7 different occasions throughout the season where the peregrine falcon visited us. That's not terribly high in our history. So we had a confirmed predation event of one of our roseate tern chicks and of a common tern chick. There probably was more than that, but those are the confirmed kills we saw. And also presence of ruddy tern stones from the end of May through early June, and then again in late July and August, which is typical for us. Let's see, other nesting species included common eiders. We had 34 nests this year. Spotted sandpipers, we observed 5. We have song sparrows breeding on the islands as well. And there was a pair of oyster catchers observed on neighboring Lunging Island, just to the northwest. And we don't have great counts for guillemots, but we definitely confirmed some guillemot nests, 7 guillemot nests on Appledore. And we know from visual observations from the water that they're breeding on Smutty Nose as well. And then I want to end just by mentioning a few of the ongoing research projects that we're conducting. As I mentioned, we collected some pretty fine scale spatial data for common tern and roseate tern nests, actually all the nests on the island this summer, and are excited to be doing some more spatial analysis to evaluate distribution with regards to habitat characteristics. We continued our application and evaluation of hypersaline spray, so real salty saltwater spray, to keep the vegetation at bay as a habitat management strategy. We continued the tern fecal collection, as I'd mentioned, and then we have a handful of student projects that are ongoing. I want to acknowledge Nate Herman and Alia Caldwell, who are in Nathan Fury's lab here at UNH, who are doing explorations of the historic tern diet and reproductive success and growth with regards to fisheries data, and a whole lot more. That's a very short version of what they're doing, but they were really diving into the historic data this summer because this was a good summer to do data mining. We have a student, Olivia Smith, an undergraduate at UNH, who's exploring butterfish presence in the diet over time and implications for growth and survival of chicks, which we're really excited about. Alia Caldwell is continuing her explorations of microplastic ingestion by looking at terns to follow up on her gull study that she did 2 years ago. And I wanted to mention, we did along with the folks up in the Gulf of Maine, most of you on this call, we did put those GPS tags out on common terns, and I know on Arctic terns as well further north last year. I wanted to mention that 4 of the 11 birds we tagged in 2019 returned again in 2020, or were observed based on leg bands. Only one of them was still carrying the leg loop harness with the GPS tag attached. And unfortunately, that bird never established a nest. It hung around for the season, probably failed very early, and we weren't able to trap it. But that tag had failed sort of in the middle of the season in 2019. So we weren't able to get any additional data because the tag was still not functioning. We weren't able to get any data through remote download. So we're hoping, we had to put any new GPS tagging on hold this season, but we're looking forward to picking it back up again next season in coordination with some boat-based fish sampling. That's going to be part of the master's thesis work for Alia Caldwell and Nathan Fury's lab. Okay, I'll leave it at that if there are any questions.
Thanks, Liz. Any questions? I don't see anything in the chat yet. I guess we'll go ahead and move on. We can certainly come back to questions after our last presentation. So we'll continue to move south and into another state, this time in Massachusetts with the folks from Monomoy. I guess I'm not sure who's going to give this presentation. We have a little bit of information. Maybe we don't have anyone on the line. I thought I'd seen a couple folks from Monomoy on the participant list, but they may have needed to jump off. So I guess rather than my rather uninformed reading of this, you all can see the slide with the information that Sue received, and maybe we'll just leave it at this. And if anyone joins here, they can add their comments. But I think if we move on from this, I'm not aware of anyone who joined the meeting from further south, from Buzzards Bay or not. I know occasionally we do have people give a report from Buzzards Bay. If there's anyone on the line who can speak to what happened there, you'd be more than welcome to jump in. I'll wait a moment for anyone to speak up. All right, well, not hearing anyone, I will go ahead and move on. So this is the last slide of what Sue prepared. And I'll just cover kind of the salient points that we want to make sure we cover before we just open it up to general discussion. But for everyone who has presented information today, please send your reports to Paula Shannon. It's Audubon's turn to compile reports, and we'd like to get those by September 15th, as indicated. If you have not signed in yet as a participant in the meeting, please do so. The link is up there on the slide. It's also in the chat in a place where you can click on it and go there. And if for some reason that Google Doc is not working, email Sue to mention that you joined the meeting. And I'll just continue to stress, as all of us are aware, stay safe, stay apart. Sue has converted our safe spacing into quantities we can all relate to, the wingspan of the birds we work with, or in the case of an albatross, the birds we wish we worked with. So that's all. That's the conclusion of our planned agenda. I'm not seeing any general questions in the chat, but I would be excited to open it up to people who'd like to provide comments or questions to the entire group. I think we can try and do that verbally, unmuting ourselves to do that if anyone's interested. If we've zoomed enough for this morning, I think that would be fine as well. I'll pause for a few moments to see if anyone has comments or questions for the group. All right. Well, not hearing anything. I would like to thank all of the presenters. This has gone really well technology-wise and information-wise. I think our transition to a virtual meeting has gone about as well as we could expect, and I think that's in great credit to all the presenters and definitely Sue Schubel. So I think with that, I'm just checking the chat again. We do have a question. Let's see. I see Lauren has a couple general questions. Maybe Lauren, if you want to unmute yourself and ask those, we can start with you.
Sure. Can you hear me? Okay.
I hear you well.
Sweet. So I had two quick questions. The first was Arctic tern specific. So for anyone who either was on an Artie Island or anyone who entered data into Seabird Finder, I have a general question about where the MSI Arctic terns may have gone because they were not there this year, but the keepers told us, I think, that the number was higher than it's been lately. So if I remember right, the last real census we did was about 500 pairs, and that's kind of a lot. So I wanted to ask anyone who was monitoring Artie this season if you either think that you may have gotten some of ours just from, I think Keenan said that it seemed like the productivity plots seemed like they had more terns in them, so I thought that might be a place. But if you recited terns and you entered them into Seabird Finder, if you saw any terns that either had been nesting at MSI recently or perhaps had been fledged from MSI and were recruiting to your island, I was just curious.
If anyone can speak to that, just unmute yourself. Make sure you're unmuted. I guess Keenan has replied in the chat. He doesn't know specifics on birds recited at Seal at the moment, but could report back on that once he's had a little time to review. But he doesn't think that the scale of increase or potential increase at Seal was, of the magnitude of 500 birds.
Right, yeah. No, it didn't seem like anything went up. It seemed like Matinic's numbers may have been a bit higher than they usually are. I can't remember what the last couple of years were, but yeah, no, I was just gonna ask generally. It didn't seem like they went en masse to any one colony. Like usually it seems they go to PMI, but the numbers weren't high enough for all of them to go there. So I don't know. They may have also just kind of skipped at the end of the season, but a lot of times in the past it seems like they have moved somewhere else. So I was just curious.
We have an additional comment from Joe who worked at PMI, and he says he does believe they had at least a few MSI parties recited there. So that at least a few individuals followed that pattern.
Yeah, I don't know if maybe once the season is done and people kind of, tabulate all their stuff together, if anyone who is on one of those islands wants to kind of give a small report, I would be really interested to know what happened. If there are stats like that, or I guess like if I get a copy of Seabird Finder, I could do it myself. But yeah, if anyone wants to write a short blurb, little paragraph for me, I would really appreciate it.
Sounds good. Lauren, you had another question as well?
Oh yeah, I guess I kind of wanted to bring up a general question. So I am not totally familiar with how the season went oceanographically either. I did look at some of our spring data, and it looked like the temperature was higher than usual, not as high as the super crazy marine heat wave years, but it seemed elevated. And I don't know, it seemed like some of the things that I heard from people seemed like there were some differences in the diet. There were a couple species that were unusual, like the mackerel. I think Keenan saw some redfish, and so those are typically more signs of warm water species that we see in kind of the odd years. The other thing I saw is that clutch size was really low for Arctic and common terns pretty much across the Gulf. It's pretty low. So I was just kind of curious about potential effects of the heat wave. I don't know if anyone wants to talk about that, but it was something that I noticed.
I'll just comment that kind of the usual locations I checked for sea surface temperature were pretty variable. Both late June and late July into August were quite warm relative to long-term averages, but other periods were more typical. So it seems like our heat came in waves that are particularly noticeable or notable towards the end of the season. It seems like consistently across islands, people are seeing dietary shifts, and that it does seem to be tracking SST pretty well for that period. But for portions of the season earlier, the surface temperatures weren't all that unusual.
Right. So do you think it was more like a mid-late July kind of effect?
I think there was a strong effect towards the end of July. Late June also, though, it was quite warm as well. So there were two waves of warm surface waters kind of in the mid-coast of Maine. I haven't looked carefully at how that tracks in the entire Gulf. But
okay, thanks.
Yeah. And then I think we had a question about peregrine falcon predation, and kind of it would be great to get people's perspectives on what people are reporting this year in terms of falcon activity and whether or not that feels typical. And Sue, I'll let you know that we're able to see you choosing your virtual background out. But if anybody wants to comment on kind of the relatively high level of reported falcon predation, I would love to hear people's perspectives on that as well.
Hey, this is Linda. And so one of the issues we've dealt with for a number of years is that Mount Desert Island, where Acadia National Park is located, I think there's 6 pairs of peregrines on that island. And so, for 30 years, they've been flying out to Petite Manane Island, which is like 28 kilometers away, multiple times a day. And then this summer in maybe late June, we discovered, as Joe mentioned, we discovered another breeding pair even closer to Petite Manane. So there were times when we had, the crew felt like adults from different breeding pairs visiting the colony. So it's certainly not a good sign for Petite Manane to have even more peregrine falcon predation than we've had in the past. But, we often have days with, 8 to 10 visits a day with 70 plus visits a season. So it's kind of a chronic issue at that colony.
Yeah, it seems like one issue that we dealt with was nocturnal disturbance when those falcon visits came very late in the day, which worries me perhaps a bit more than kind of the steady take of small numbers of adults and chicks. But yeah, it seems like this is a problem we'll be facing into the future.
Hi, if I can add just another comment on the peregrines. It seems that we've been seeing this a lot in recent years. It's not new. It may be building. It would be interesting to know where those peregrines are coming from and to see if there's any collaborations that can be built with peregrine researchers looking at the nest sites where these peregrines are, just to document what they're eating. I mean, we know what they're eating, but to see maybe what proportion of the diets, how important they are. And I would say that as these colonies get to be over 1,000 pairs, they can probably handle some peregrine predation, and it's great to have the peregrines back, of course. So just kind of broaden our view a little bit, maybe. A small colony can have a huge effect, but once a colony gets the size of pond, it's hard to watch, but it's still something they can. I don't think it's a significant factor if you look at the size of the colony, especially if they're taking fledglings. One other thought is that I know that over the years we have used the proportion of diet in seabirds to show what kinds of foods they're eating. But I think this might be missing the importance of some of the new foods, especially. I'm thinking of haddock in particular. Maybe calculations that include mass of the fish will help us to better make the case that these new fish are not only increasing, but are dominating the food that the young are getting. And when we're trying to improve fisheries policy, pointing to the significance that really, I think this year, it looks like the haddock really made all the difference for puffins from what I've seen of the data, but I'm not sure our data shows that when we still show that hake is more common than haddock. Just a thought. And we can present it both ways, but I think Lauren has the conversions to make that possible if we want to start including that.
Thanks, Steve. I do agree that thinking about diet in terms of biomass contribution rather than solely frequency would be an important step to take for us. Linda, did you have another comment maybe on peregrines again? I thought I heard you jump in there.
Oh, yeah. I was just going to say, in the last 2 years, Maine Fish and Wildlife has really ramped up their peregrine falcon monitoring and do repeated visits at all known eyries, historic eyries, potential sites. And so they do have a running list of where all the known peregrine falcon sites are and what their productivity was. So Erin Call is the raptor biologist for IF&W, and I'm sure she could share that with people. There's kind of a Google Drive that we're all contributing to, so. That's all. You might be able to figure out where your birds are likely coming from.
That's a great suggestion. Thanks. Do we have other topics people would like to touch on? Other perspectives from the season? I certainly would compliment the group for persevering and getting work done this year despite all the challenges. I think collectively we've been fortunate, but also we should note how much hard work so many of us have done to keep things going in terms of both stewardship, monitoring, and some research work as well. Well, I'm not seeing or hearing of anyone wanting to continue the conversation. So I'm inclined to wrap it at this. Again, thanks to all of our presenters, and thanks to everyone in the audience for joining. We'll look for reports to Paula in September, and we'll look forward to maybe actually seeing each other in person, maybe next spring, maybe this time next year. Hopefully we'll be moving in the right direction on the virus by then. Okay, well, thanks everyone. Stay safe, enjoy the rest of summer, and we'll be in touch.